Ethan Miller thought he was traveling to Florida for love, while Lila waited at the station with nothing but hope and a handmade card. But when their worlds collided, obsession and deception turned into one of the most brutal crimes investigators had ever seen. Ethan Miller lived a life that many would describe as invisible. At 29, he drifted through his days working at a warehouse in Ohio, clocking in and out without conversation, returning each evening to a dimly lit apartment where the silence pressed down like a weight. His only escape was his computer, the glowing screen that offered a window into worlds he would never see in person. It was on one of those late nights, scrolling through online chat rooms, that Ethan first noticed a profile that stood out from the rest. The name was Lila. Her picture showed her smiling at the beach, sunlight on her face, a small flower tucked behind her ear. Unlike others who filled their messages with sarcasm or jokes, her words felt open and warm, as though she truly wanted to connect. At first, Ethan approached cautiously, typing short replies, testing the waters. But soon he found himself waiting for her messages like a lifeline. Days at work no longer dragged because he knew at night he would hear from her. They shared stories of their childhoods, their fears, and dreams. She told him she lived in Florida, near the ocean, a world so different from the gray, landlocked place he called home. The more they talked, the more Ethan felt alive. He began to imagine a future with her, one where he wasn't just another nameless worker lost in routine. Lila gave him hope, something he hadn't felt in years. He convinced himself that she was real, that she was meant for him, and that the distance between Ohio and Florida was only a small obstacle. Each message drew him deeper, and soon he was no longer satisfied with a screen. He needed to meet her face to face. Ethan's life began to revolve entirely around Lila. What started as casual late-night chats quickly grew into long hours spent online, ignoring calls from family and brushing off invitations from his few remaining friends. His closest companion, Mark, noticed the change immediately. Ethan no longer cared about hanging out after work or watching weekend football. Instead, his evenings were consumed by typing furiously at his keyboard, his face illuminated by the glow of the monitor. When Mark asked about it, Ethan would shrug, saying only that he was talking to someone important. In truth, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Every photo Lila sent, every cheerful message, fueled his belief that she was unlike anyone else. She wasn't critical or dismissive like others he had tried to talk to online. She seemed genuinely happy to hear from him, always responding quickly, always ready to share about her day. Ethan began skipping overtime shifts just to rush home, sacrificing extra income he had once depended on. Instead, he funneled his money into planning for the inevitable trip south. He started browsing bus tickets, checking hotel prices, and calculating exactly how much he would need. Mark grew frustrated, warning him repeatedly that online romances were rarely what they seemed. But Ethan refused to listen. His obsession deepened each time he reread her messages, memorizing her words as if they were proof of destiny. His apartment walls, once bare, became cluttered with notes and scribbled plans about routes and dates. Even during his warehouse shifts, he daydreamed of Lila waiting for him at a sunny Florida station. He pictured her arms open, welcoming him into a new life. To Ethan, it no longer felt like fantasy, it felt inevitable. Meeting her was no longer a dream. It was a mission. The morning Ethan finally set out, the air was cold and damp, but his chest buzzed with restless energy. He had spent weeks planning every detail, double-checking his route, his small stash of cash tucked into his wallet, and the bouquet of flowers he bought at a corner shop before leaving. The journey from Ohio to Florida felt like more than just miles. It felt like crossing into a new life. He told himself that once he stepped off the bus, everything would change. The bus station was crowded, filled with travelers hauling suitcases and whispering into phones, but Ethan barely noticed. His thoughts stayed fixed on Lila. He boarded with nervous hands, choosing a seat by the window, where he could stare at the blur of passing towns and highways. Every mile closer filled him with both excitement and anxiety. He rehearsed what he would say when he saw her, imagining her face lighting up, imagining their first hug. In his mind, the meeting played like a scene from a movie, one that ended with him never being alone again. The trip stretched on for hours. At each stop, he fought the temptation to call her, wanting to surprise her instead. He clutched the flowers tightly, careful not to crush them, as though they carried the weight of his feelings. Sleep barely touched him, his head filled with images of warm beaches, salty air, and Lila's smile. By the time the bus rolled into Florida, the exhaustion of travel couldn't dull his anticipation. His heart pounded against his chest as he stepped off the bus, scanning the station for her face. With every step forward, he believed he was walking into the happiest moment of his life. The fantasy was seconds away from becoming reality. Ethan's breath caught as he spotted a young woman standing near the station entrance, holding a small handmade card with his name carefully written across the front. His heart leapt at first, recognizing the smile he had memorized from her photos. But as he drew closer, his steps faltered. Lila wasn't what he had pictured in his endless daydreams. Her features revealed a truth she had never shared online. She had Down syndrome. She waved shyly, her eyes bright with innocence, and held out the card as if it were the most precious gift she could give. For a moment, Ethan froze. The flowers in his hands suddenly felt heavy. All the late-night messages, the promises he had built in his mind, twisted into something that no longer matched the image he had created. He felt blindsided, almost betrayed, as though she had hidden a truth that shattered the dream he had clung to for months. Around them, travelers hurried past with bags and tickets, oblivious to the storm rising inside him. Lila stepped forward with a nervous giggle, clearly excited to meet him, but Ethan's face remained rigid. Instead of joy, his chest filled with frustration and anger. He couldn't process the reality standing in front of him. The fantasy he had chased all the way from Ohio seemed to collapse in seconds, replaced by confusion and resentment. Still, Lila reached for him, offering the card she had made. Its edges were decorated with small drawings of hearts, carefully colored in. She had clearly spent hours preparing it. Ethan barely looked at it. His mind churned with the weight of his disappointment, and though she smiled, his thoughts grew darker. What should have been the happiest moment of his life had turned into something he couldn't accept. Ethan's pulse thundered as he stood before Lila, his mind unraveling in ways he couldn't control. He had traveled hundreds of miles, carrying dreams of love and belonging, but now he felt mocked by the reality in front of him. Every imagined future, walking hand in hand on the beach, building a life together, shattered in an instant. The shame of being fooled burned inside him, twisting quickly into rage. To Ethan, it wasn't just disappointment, it was betrayal. He convinced himself she had lied, that she had deliberately hidden the truth to trap him. The flowers slipped from his hands, petals scattering onto the dirty pavement. He glanced around, noticing how no one seemed to care, how people moved past them without a second look. That sense of invisibility fueled his anger even more. Without a word, he grabbed Lila roughly by the arm, yanking her away from the flow of travelers and toward a shadowy alley near the edge of the station. She stumbled, the handmade card fluttering from her grasp, landing face down on the ground. Inside the narrow alley, far from the busier lights, Ethan's fury boiled over. His thoughts blurred, reduced to raw emotion and violence. He lashed out, striking her with a force that silenced her cheerful demeanor instantly. She crumpled under the weight of his attack, her body folding against the cold concrete. The sound of impact echoed in the confined space, but Ethan's adrenaline drowned out everything else. For a fleeting moment, he saw what he had done. Lila motionless, her innocence crushed beneath his rage. Panic rippled through him, but the anger still pulsed, clouding reason. The fantasy he had nurtured for so long had died, and in its place, something brutal and irreversible had taken hold. Angela Parker was exhausted after a long shift at the diner where she worked. Her feet ached, and all she wanted was to get home and collapse into bed. She took her usual shortcut through the back streets near the bus station, a quiet path she walked nearly every night. As she passed by the narrow alley, a strange movement caught her eye. At first, she thought it was just a couple arguing, but something about the scene felt wrong. A man loomed over a smaller figure, his movements frantic and aggressive. Angela slowed her steps, her stomach tightening. She could barely see in the dim light, but when she noticed the bouquet of flowers scattered near the alley entrance, her instincts screamed. The figure on the ground didn't move. That was enough for Angela to know she couldn't ignore it. She quickly ducked behind a nearby post, pulling her phone from her pocket with shaking hands. Dialing 911, She whispered what she saw, her voice trembling but urgent. As she waited for police to arrive, she peeked again, catching a glimpse of Ethan's face twisted with panic as he hovered over the young woman. Angela didn't know who they were or what had happened, but she knew she was watching something dangerous unfold. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared he might hear her, but she stayed put, determined to do the right thing. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens began to cut through the night air. Angela felt both relief and dread. She had no idea whether the girl was alive, nor how violent the man might become if he realized someone had seen him. But one thing was certain. Her call had set events in motion that could not be undone. Ethan's chest tightened as the reality of what he had done crashed over him. His hands shook, his clothes felt damp with sweat, and every nerve screamed at him to run. He staggered out of the alley, leaving Lila's small body behind, and tried to blend into the movement of the bus station. The bouquet he had brought for her lay trampled, its petals sticking to his shoes as he hurried away. He knew he couldn't stay there. Cameras hung above the entrances, their red lights blinking, recording every frantic move he made. His first thought was to get on another bus, disappear into the crowd of travelers heading anywhere but Florida. But as he scanned the schedules, his panic grew. His money was low, his nerves too frayed to think clearly. He ducked into the bathroom, splashing water on his face, staring at his reflection. The man looking back was wild-eyed, unrecognizable. He couldn't undo what had happened, and the weight of it made him feel like he was suffocating. Desperation pushed him to flee on foot. He left the station, darting through side streets, discarding the jacket he wore and tossing his phone into a trash bin. He convinced himself that if he moved fast enough, he could vanish before anyone pieced the night together. But every corner he turned only reminded him of the mistake, the trail he had already left behind. Security cameras at the bus station, witnesses who might have seen him with the flowers, and worst of all, the woman who had watched from the shadows, though Ethan didn't know it. By the time he reached the edge of town, his lungs burned and his legs ached. He thought he had escaped, but the walls of evidence were already closing in around him. Detectives arrived at the bus station within minutes of the call. The scene was chaotic. Officers securing the area, paramedics rushing Lila to the hospital, and curious onlookers whispering about the young woman carried out on a stretcher. Though badly injured, Lila was still breathing, her pulse faint but steady. That single sign of life pushed investigators to act quickly. They treated the case not as a mystery, but as an urgent hunt for a violent suspect. Surveillance footage provided their first breakthrough. Cameras had caught Ethan arriving with flowers in hand, clearly waiting for someone. The same cameras later showed him dragging Lila toward the alley and then stumbling back out, frantic and disheveled. His face was clear, his clothes distinctive, and his every movement timed and logged. Witness statements added more pieces. A ticket clerk remembered the nervous man buying a one-way ticket days earlier, and Angela provided her account of what she had seen in the shadows. Detectives pieced the story together quickly. This wasn't a random attack. It was targeted, fueled by an online connection that had spiraled into obsession. They retrieved the discarded phone from a trash bin near the station, recovering fragments of conversations with Lila, messages that revealed months of building intensity, his promises to meet her, and his growing fixation. Each digital trace painted a chilling picture of a man who could not separate fantasy from reality. Meanwhile, doctors fought to stabilize Lila. Her survival meant she might one day testify, but for now, she remained unconscious, her body struggling to recover. Investigators worked tirelessly, knowing the suspect could be anywhere. But his mistakes, the flowers, the cameras, the digital trail, gave them confidence. Ethan Miller had left too much behind. It was only a matter of time before they found him. Ethan thought he had found safety in the dim, run-down motel at the edge of town. The neon sign outside flickered weakly, casting red and blue light across the cracked walls of his room. He sat on the bed, still in the same stained clothes, replaying the night in his head. The sounds of the alley echoed in his ears, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lila's face staring back at him. Sleep refused to come, replaced by the gnawing dread that someone was already hunting him. Back at the station, detectives followed the trail with precision. Security footage had not only captured Ethan's face, but also the direction he ran. Witnesses reported a man matching his description near convenience stores and side streets. By morning, his image was circulating across patrol units. Angela had already given a detailed statement, and combined with the digital evidence from his discarded phone, there was no doubt about who he was. The only question left was where he had gone. His downfall came when he stepped out of the motel to buy food. A clerk recognized him immediately from the police bulletins and quietly alerted authorities. Ethan returned to his room unaware, pacing the floor and trying to figure out his next move. Within the hour, officers surrounded the building. The knock on his door was followed by shouts, and before he could react, the door burst open. Ethan didn't resist. His body sagged as if the fight had drained out of him long before the arrest. Handcuffs snapped around his wrists, cold and final. As he was led past the flashing lights and curious bystanders, he realized the fantasy he had built for months had ended not in love, but in humiliation, violence, and capture. News of the crime spread quickly, shocking both the small Ohio town where Ethan came from and the Florida community where the attack had unfolded. Headlines painted him as a man consumed by obsession, someone who crossed state lines chasing a fantasy that ended in brutality. For days, television anchors replayed the surveillance footage of him arriving at the bus station with flowers, contrasting that hopeful image with the horror that followed. The story struck a nerve with the public, a chilling reminder of how dangerous unchecked loneliness and rage could become. Lila survived, though her recovery was long and difficult. She spent weeks in the hospital, surrounded by family and staff who marveled at her resilience. The handmade card she had carried that night was returned to her, crumpled and stained, but it became a symbol of her innocence and strength. Though she spoke little at first, her presence in the courtroom months later was powerful. Her quiet bravery reminded everyone that she was more than a victim, she was a survivor. Angela, the passerby whose instincts saved Lila's life, was hailed as a hero. Community members praised her quick decision to call for help, and law enforcement credited her with preventing a tragedy from turning fatal. She struggled with the memory of what she had seen, but she took comfort in knowing her actions had mattered. As for Ethan, his trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. The footage, the phone messages, the witnesses. He was sentenced to decades in prison, his future sealed behind bars. No longer the invisible man he once was, he became a cautionary tale. In the end, the case left scars on everyone involved, but it also carried a message. Truth and reality cannot be twisted into fantasy without consequences.